Hey guys, so we are going to start off with chapter one. And I was trying to figure out how to start it off, and then I decided that there was somebody who could start it off better than I could. So we're going to let Carol Baskin start off our class.
Hey, you cool cats and kittens. This is Carol from Big Cat Rescue. And for today's daily update, I'm just going to tell you what I've been doing. Hello, you cool cats and kittens. Hello, you cool cats and kittens. Hello, you cool cats and kittens. It's Carol at Big Cat Rescue. Hello, you cool cats and kittens.
Really, I just figured that that would be way better than anything that I could show you to start off with, and hopefully make Texas government slightly more interesting for your Maymester. So we're going to switch over from Carol Baskin's. Also, for those of you who think I've lost my mind, I haven't. Tiger King, it's on Netflix. It's a thing. You should watch it. Do yourself a favor. So we're going to stop sharing that screen now, and now we're going to switch over to Texas government. All right. Share now. All right. So we're starting off with chapter one, Texas political culture and diversity. So you're going to see these learning objective slides at the very beginning of each chapter. That's basically just giving you an overview of what you're supposed to have learned by the time that the course finishes. So let's start first by talking about ideology, political ideology in Texas. The really interesting thing about political ideology is that if you ask most people what they identify as, they'll come out and say conservative or liberal, which usually translates into Republican or Democrat. But when you press people a little bit on what that actually means, there are quite a few people who really have no idea what it means to be a conservative or what it means to be a liberal. So that's how we're going to start off this chapter, is we're just going to start by talking about what exactly does that mean, and how can we identify somebody who is a liberal versus somebody who is a conservative? Now, understand that when we're talking about this, we're going to be talking in broad strokes. So this doesn't mean that every single person who identifies as a conservative is going to follow the conservative viewpoint on every single thing. Same thing with liberals. This is broad strokes. What's the general ideology? So ideology just means, what does somebody believe in? So let's start off first with conservatives. What do conservatives believe in? Conservatives believe in a political ideology marked by the belief in a limited role for government in taxation, economic regulation, and providing social services. Conservatives tend to support traditional values and lifestyles and are cautious in response to social change. So on the whole, conservatives tend to be opposed to things like abortion, birth control access, LGBTQ rights, same-sex marriage. That tends to be a conservative viewpoint. They also tend to be in favor of things like lower taxation. When it comes to liberal policy, a liberal ideology is marked by the advocacy of using government to improve the welfare of individuals, government regulation of the economy, support for civil rights, and tolerance for social change. So generally speaking, liberals tend to favor a larger government, and they tend to favor a government that is going to provide social support services. So things like WIC or SNAP or TANF, any of those social support programs that are really used to help assist people who are maybe not doing so well socioeconomically, those are traditionally going to be things that liberals favor. So that's the big difference between liberal versus conservative ideology. Liberal tends to believe in a little bit larger government, a little bit higher taxes, more social protection. Conservative ideology tends to believe in a smaller government, also less social protections that are kind of etched in. Okay, so what about Texas? We've got 47% of individuals who are identifying as conservative and 22% who are identifying as liberal. Remember, you don't have to identify with either of those two groups. So you could say you're an independent, or you could actually label what type of independent you are. You could say, I believe in the Green Party, or I believe in the Libertarian Party. Those are some of the parties and ideologies that we're going to talk about a little bit later on in the course. But for right now, just understand that we've got 47% identifying as conservative and 22% identifying as liberal. Now, clearly, we can see a majority are identifying as conservative. But what I'd like to do in just a second here is I'd like to take a look at Texan ideology. So Texas political culture tends to be pretty conservative. What do we mean by political culture? A political culture reflects the dominant political values and beliefs of a people. It explains how people feel about their government, their expectations of what powers it should have over their lives, the services it should provide, and their ability to influence its actions. Many Texans share a belief in a limited role for government in taxation, economic regulation, and providing social services. Conservatives support traditional values and lifestyles and are cautious in response to social change. So that goes back to what we were talking about with regards to LGBTQ rights or abortion rights. In general, Texas tends to be a little bit more conservative, which means that the Texas population tends to be a little bit more uneasy when it comes to those types of rights. Okay. So let me see if I can make this a little bit larger for y'all. Hopefully I can. Okay, we're just going to leave it there. You can get a copy of it in the Lessons tab. It's going to be PowerPoint 1. So if it's too small for any of you to see, just note that the red indicates conservative, the gray indicates moderate, and the blue is going to go ahead and indicate liberal ideology. So you can see that we've divided people's ideology based on generation, ethnicity and race, gender, and then just all registered voters in general. So what you see here is we're dividing this more and more and more. So let's start first by just looking at the difference between men and women. On the whole, who's going to tend to be more conservative, men or women? Men, right? Because we see a larger portion of that pie chart is going to be the red, which indicates that a larger portion of males identify as conservative as opposed to women. So what are some of the things that might account for that? Well, that's obviously going to be a really nuanced conversation, right? It's going to have a lot of detail. But we know that there are going to be some key factors. If we ask men about something like military spending, in general, we tend to see a more favorable response to increases in military spending for men over women. That tends to be a more conservative viewpoint. Same thing on the other side if we're talking about education spending. Women, on the whole, tend to be more in favor of spending when it comes to educational resources. That tends to be a more liberal viewpoint. Also, we tend to see women place a greater emphasis on bodily autonomy when it comes to things like their reproductive freedom. So they tend to care a lot more about birth control access, about abortion rights access than their male counterparts. Again, we're still talking in broad strokes. This is not going to be every single woman or every single man, but on the whole, those are some of the differences that we see that maybe account for some of that gender divide. What about ethnicity and race? Over here, we can see the red tends to be a lot larger in the Anglo pie chart. Whereas when we look over in the Latino pie chart or the African American pie chart, we actually see that the conservative ideology has gone to be the minority ideology. And instead, we're seeing a lot more moderates over here. So what are some of the things that are maybe making African Americans and Latinos less conservative than their Anglo counterparts? Again, a very nuanced conversation. But some of those things might have to do with affirmative action, the idea that we give preferential treatment to Latinos and African Americans in certain educational or vocational settings. That tends to be a more moderate or liberal viewpoint. That tends to not be something that's supported by conservative ideology. Also, things like DACA, immigration, are at the top of the national stage right now. Most people who are African American or Latino tend to feel a little bit more lax when compared to their Anglo counterparts when it comes to immigration, which means that they tend to want to see a pathway to citizenship for those young kids who are brought over. They tend to not be very in favor of the wall that we all hear about being built. So those also some of those policies that are going to account for that difference. Again, broad strokes, there's going to be a lot of different things that account for the differences here, but those are just some of them. All right, generational divide. So here we see millennial going all the way up to the silent generation. So the millennial generation is going to be the youngest generation that's polled here, and then silent is going to be the oldest. So you can see as you increase in age, you also tend to increase in terms of conservatism. And that's not just in Texas, that's across the United States. So what are some of the things that are accounting for that? Well, part of it just has to do with how much you're paying in taxes generally. So the younger you are, the less likely you are to be paying a significant amount when it comes to taxes. So things like social service programs and getting taxed at a higher rate, that tends to feel a little bit more okay to people when they're not actually getting taxed at a higher rate. The older you get, the more you're probably being taxed, and so the more likely you are to be a little bit more reluctant to want to see an increase in taxation for those social structures. Another thing that might account for this is social change. So if we take, let's say, the baby boomer generation, which at this point is right around 70-ish, or the silent generation that's even older, they've seen a lot of change during the course of their lifetime. So, for example, Roe v. Wade, what legalized abortion, that didn't even come around until the 70s. When we talk about LGBTQ rights, really, it wasn't until the 2000s that we started to see significant gains for lesbian and gay couples. When we started talking about transgender issues, we've really only now, within the last 5 years, started to see that be more commonly and generally accepted. So that's a lot of social change for those individuals to have taken in within the course of their lifetime. As a result, they're going to tend to sometimes lean a little bit more towards the party that's a little bit more hesitant to embrace that type of social change. So again, broad strokes, those are just some of the factors that might account for those differences there. Okay, partisanship. So about 11% of Texans are true independents. That means that if you go in and you start asking people really specific questions, like how do you feel about abortion access? How do you feel about the death penalty? How do you feel about immigration? And you start cataloging their responses based on their answers to that, as opposed to how they self-identify. What you're going to find is that only about 11% are going to be true independents, meaning that they don't really heavily lean one way or the other. You're going to see a substantial gender, ethnic, racial, and generational difference in party identification for some of the reasons that we just went through. And in Texas, you're going to see strong Republican dominance for the last 20 years. So in Chapter 3, we're going to talk about maybe what are some of the things that account for that difference. Okay. So conservative public policy on the whole. Conservative opinion tends to be, like we talked about, in favor of lower taxes, fewer financial resources committed to public services, so things like public transportation, for example, or social welfare programs, conservative social values on issues like abortion, casino gambling, and the use of marijuana for medicinal purposes. So in general, tends to be opposed to things like abortion or casino gambling or the use of marijuana. Okay, so that gives you a little bit of an overview when it comes to Texas political ideology. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to break this chapter into a few different parts, mostly because I have dogs who are looking at me like I am nuts because I've been sitting at a computer all day. So I'm going to go ahead. We're going to pause this recording session here, and then we will pick back up with Texas cultural region.